The wind felt like the last breath of a dying world, scouring the desert flats and carrying nothing but dust and silence. It was the kind of wind that made a man feel utterly alone. Sam Ness rode against it, his shoulders squared to the sting of grit. Fence wire rattled behind his saddle. The thought of home was a steady weight in his chest. Home was Lucy and Hope, his two girls, waiting by the cottonwoods. Lucy, his eldest, would be on the porch rail, still as a hawk, pretending she wasn't watching the road for him. She always was. Hope, just 4, would charge at his legs, a whirlwind of curls and chatter, a stream of words about everything and nothing at all. A faint smile touched Sam's lips, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Up ahead, the road shimmered. Something dark lay crumpled by the ditch. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of rags dropped from a passing wagon. Then he saw it. The unmistakable shape of an arm. He pulled the reins hard, swinging down from his horse. His boots crunched on the baked earth. A woman. She was lying on her side, half buried in dust, her dress a faded brown that might have been blue once. A straw bonnet had fallen back, and her lips were cracked and white. Sam crouched, resting a hand near her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. Her eyes fluttered open. They were pale, the color of a stormy sky. Then they rolled shut again. She didn't make a sound. He felt for her breath. It was there. Faint, uneven, but it was there. His plan had been to ride past town, to get home. But now a question lodged in his throat. What kind of man leaves another soul to die in the dust? He had no use for strays. Life was hard enough. He already had mouths to feed. But then he saw her hand. Small, the fingers bruised and burned by the sun. It unsettled him. He thought of Lucy. He thought of Hope. He thought of how fast the desert could strip the life from a person. All right, he muttered to himself and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile weight. She didn't stir as he laid her across his saddle. The cabin appeared near sundown, a squat cedar building with a thin line of smoke curling from its chimney. The cottonwoods by the creek whispered in the evening air. He swung down, the woman still in his arms, and carried her onto the porch. Lucy was there, just as he knew she'd be. She held a rag doll, and her brown eyes narrowed at the sight of the stranger. "Who's that?" she demanded, her voice flat and hard. "Found her on the road." Hope darted out from behind the door, her curls bouncing. "Papa! Papa, is she dead?" "No," Sam said, shifting the woman's weight. "She just needs rest." Lucy's mouth formed a tight line, but she held the door open for him. Inside, Sam laid the woman on the narrow cot by the hearth. The cabin was simple. 1 table, 3 chairs, shelves of jars lining the wall. Traces of his late wife, Anna, still lingered in the woven mats on the floor, in the beaded strips Lucy kept dusted but never spoke of. Hope scrambled up onto the cot, peering at the woman's face. The woman stirred, her brow furrowed in a pained expression. Then her eyes snapped open. They weren't unfocused anymore. They were fixed on Hope's small, round face. "Eli." The word was torn from her throat, raw and broken, like it had been trapped there for a lifetime. Before Sam could react, she lunged. She wrapped both arms around Hope, pulling the little girl into a desperate, crushing embrace. Hope let out a squeal of surprise, but she didn't fight. She was too stunned. Lucy gasped, rushing forward. "Papa!" Sam moved quickly, his hands firm but not rough, as he eased the woman back onto the cot. Her arms went slack, and she sagged against the pillow, her whole body trembling. "Easy," he said. "You're safe here." Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with tears that she fought to blink away. Hope wriggled free, more confused than scared. "Papa!" She thought I was somebody else. Sam just nodded, but a knot had tightened in his chest. The way she'd said that name, Eli. like a wound being ripped open all over again. Lucy stood guard between the cot and the hearth, her arms crossed tight. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, never left the woman's face. Sam knew that look. It was the same one she gave the well-meaning neighbors who'd tried to offer comfort after her mother died. Later, as Sam bent to unlace his dusty boots, Lucy cornered him. "She can't stay," she whispered, her voice fierce. "She'll take your time from us." Sam paused, meeting his daughter's gaze. She was only 8, but she carried the weight of someone much older, the weight of her mother's absence. "She's here for tonight, Lucy," he said quietly. "That's all." Lucy pressed her lips together, unconvinced, but she didn't argue. The night settled in, heavy and thick. Sam sat at the table, mending a piece of tack, the leather smooth under his calloused fingers. The girls whispered in the corner, their heads close together. The woman, he still didn't know her name, lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. Rose. The name just appeared in his mind, as if he'd always known it. A few times, she murmured something in her sleep, words he couldn't quite catch. When the lamp started to burn low, he stood up and pulled the thin blanket up over her shoulders. His hand brushed against the fabric she clutched to her chest. It was a shawl, worn thin as a moth's wing. He thought he saw the glisten of tears on her temple, even though her eyes were closed. He glanced over at his daughters. Hope had fallen asleep, her head resting against Lucy's side. But Lucy was still awake, watchful, her eyes half open, fixed on the stranger who had invaded their home. Sam stepped outside, onto the porch. The wind had died down. The stars were scattered across the black sky like cornmeal on a stone slab. He stood there for a long time, letting the silence of the night wash over him. When he turned to go back inside, he realized the house no longer felt as empty as it had for so long. But emptiness, he knew, was safe. Hope was dangerous. Hope could cut you deeper than any knife if it failed. Still, as he looked at the frail woman sleeping under his roof, Sam knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow, she would still be there. Morning came with the cry of meadowlarks. Soft light slid through the cabin's narrow windows, brushing across his daughters' faces. Hope was the first to stir. She wriggled out from under her blanket, her hair a wild tangle of curls, and crept over to the cot by the fire. The stranger was still there. Rose. Hope crouched down, her morning breath a warm cloud in the cool air. "Hey, wake up, lady. Papa says you're safe. You want breakfast? We only have mush today." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But Papa put sugar in mine when Lucy's not looking." The woman's eyes opened slowly. She blinked against the light. Her lips parted, but she only managed a faint nod, as slight as a blade of grass bending in the wind. From across the room, Lucy watched, already dressed, her fingers moving briskly as she braided her hair. "Hope, leave her be," she said. Her tone was sharp, edged with suspicion. Hope made a face at her sister. "She's lonely." "Or she's trouble," Lucy shot back, tying off her braid with a scrap of cloth. She stood stiff as a fence post and looked at Sam, who had just pulled on his boots. "Papa, she shouldn't stay." Sam didn't answer her. Instead, he poured water from the bucket into a tin basin and set it near the cot. He gestured to the woman. "Wash, then eat." Rose pulled herself up slowly, her shoulders hunched. She dipped her hands into the cool water, scrubbing her face like she was trying to wash away more than just the dust. She never once let go of that tattered shawl. Breakfast was a quiet, tense affair. Cornmeal mush, thick and steaming. Sam ate in silence with Lucy sitting stiffly beside him. Hope, on the other hand, chattered non-stop, her spoon tapping against her bowl with every word. "My doll's name is Annie. Do you have a doll?" "Probably not. You're a grown-up." Papa says grown-ups don't need dolls, but Lucy still has hers. She hides it under her quilt. I do not! Lucy snapped, her face flushing red. The woman flinched at the sharp sound, her eyes dropping back to her bowl. She lifted her spoon, but barely ate. Sam watched her. He knew silence. His own silence was a shield, protecting wounds he couldn't speak of. But hers was different. It wasn't proud or defiant. It was the silence of someone terrified that if she opened her mouth, all the grief she was holding inside would come pouring out. When the meal was done, she stood up without a word and gathered the bowls. She washed them in the basin, her hands steady, though her breath hitched once or twice. Lucy watched her, arms crossed. She doesn't have to do that, she muttered. Sam put a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Let her. Hope beamed, swinging her legs under the table. See, Lucy? She likes helping. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Rose barely spoke, answering questions with nods or single, whispered words, but her hands were never still. She swept the corners of the cabin that were always missed. She mended a tear in one of Hope's dresses. She patched a frayed spot in the curtain. Every evening, Sam came home from his work to find these small changes. The hearth swept clean, the shelves neatly ordered, a fresh bucket of water drawn from the creek. It unsettled Lucy. She saw every small act as an attack, an attempt to erase her mother's memory. One afternoon, Sam came home early. He found Rose on the floor by the doorway with Hope. They had gathered a handful of wildflowers from the creek bank, yellow sunbursts that were already starting to wilt in the heat. Rose was arranging them in an old glass jar, filling it with water. Hope clapped her hands. Look, Papa, she made it pretty. Sam's eyes lingered on the jar, then on Rose. She didn't look at him. From the porch, Lucy scoffed. They'll be dead by tomorrow. Rose's hand froze over the jar. She didn't reply, but Sam saw the flicker of pain that crossed her face. Something inside him tightened. He looked at Lucy, her chin jutting out stubbornly. Flowers die, Lucy, Sam said, his voice even. But they remind us to look at them while they're here. Lucy blinked, startled by his words. She turned away, clutching her doll to her chest. The nights were the hardest. After the girls were asleep, the cabin would grow quiet. Sam would sit by the dying fire, sharpening his knife or mending leather. Rose would sit near the hearth, wrapped in her shawl, her face hidden in the shadows. One night, the wind rattled the shutters, and he heard her whisper a name, soft and broken. Eli. He looked up, but she hadn't realized he'd heard. Her shoulders were trembling. She pressed the worn shawl to her lips as if to stifle a sob. He wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort. But the words wouldn't come. Some wounds were too deep to be touched. They needed space. They needed silence. So he just stirred the fire, letting its warmth say what he could not. On the third evening, Lucy's restraint finally broke. While Rose was helping Hope wash up at the basin, Lucy cornered her father outside. Papa, she said, her voice fierce, though tears shimmered in her eyes. Why is she still here? She doesn't belong with us. She'll take you away from us. Sam crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The lantern light caught the jagged line of the scar on his jaw, but his eyes were steady. Lucy, he said quietly, I lost your mama. That doesn't mean my heart ran out of room. You and Hope are everything to me. No one can ever take that away. She looks at you, Lucy whispered, her fear laid bare. Sam shook his head. No, she looks at the floor, because she's lost more than we can even imagine. Sometimes people just need a roof over their head until they remember how to stand on their own 2 feet. That's all this is. Lucy bit her lip, torn between her fear and her father's words. She turned and rushed back inside before he could say anything more. Sam stood in the cool night air for a long moment, looking up at the stars. He thought of the woman sleeping in his cabin, of his daughter's fierce mistrust, and of the strange, waiting silence that had filled their home. It was no longer empty, but it wasn't full either. It was waiting. Waiting for words that hadn't been spoken yet. Waiting for a trust that hadn't been earned. And though he was bone-weary, Sam felt the pull of something ancient and powerful, the possibility that even from the deepest silence, a voice could rise again. By the fourth morning, the silence at the breakfast table felt heavier than the log walls of the cabin. Sam watched his daughters over the rim of his bowl. Steam from the corn mush rose between them like a ghost. Rose sat at the far end of the table, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, even though the morning was warm. She moved the mush around in her bowl with her spoon but didn't eat. Her eyes were fixed on the wooden tabletop. Hope, restless as always, kicked her legs against her chair and chattered away. "Papa, did you know my doll Annie can sit up all by herself if I lean her just right? Lucy says she's too old for dolls, but I think she's just jealous." "I am not," Lucy muttered, stabbing at her food with her spoon. Rose glanced up at that, a tiny flicker of interest in her eyes before her gaze dropped again. Hope tilted her head, studying the quiet woman. Then, with the blunt, innocent cruelty that only a child possesses, she asked, "Did you ever have a doll? Or a baby?" The spoon fell from Rose's hand, clattering against the wooden bowl. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. A knot of dread tightened in Sam's gut. He started to rise from his chair, ready to silence Hope, to stop this before it went any further. But before he could speak, Rose found her voice. It was rough from disuse, trembling and soft. "A baby? Yes." Hope's eyes went wide. "Where is he?" The air in the cabin grew taut. Even Lucy looked up, her suspicion momentarily forgotten. Rose swallowed hard, her hand clutching at her shawl as if it were the only thing holding her together. He's gone." Hope frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Gone where?" "Enough, Hope," Sam said, his voice quiet but firm, but Rose shook her head faintly. Her eyes shimmered, fragile as sunlit glass. "No, it's a fair question." She took a breath, ragged but steady. "My boy's name was Eli. He was 5 years old. A fever took him last winter." She paused, her voice cracking. 2 months later, my husband followed him. I buried them both on a hill where the wind always sings. When the ground froze solid, I didn't have any reason left to stay." The words hung in the air, raw and final, heavy as gravestones. Hope's face crumpled, the sudden sharp sorrow of a child dawning in her eyes. She slid from her chair, scrambled into Rose's lap, and wrapped her small arms around the woman's neck. Rose let out a soft gasp at the unexpected touch. Then she held the little girl close, her body racked with silent sobs. Lucy just stared, caught somewhere between pity and her old familiar fear. Her doll lay forgotten on the floor beside her. Sam didn't move. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes under his scarred skin. He knew the weight of graves. He knew it all too well. That night, long after the girls were asleep, Sam lingered by the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the cabin in shades of muted gold. Rose sat across from him, her shawl now folded neatly in her lap, her hands clenched in the worn fabric. "You didn't have to tell them that," Sam said. His voice was low, not an accusation, just a statement. Rose shook her head. "Silence can drown a person worse than any flood. I'd been holding it in for too long." She pressed the shawl to her lips. "When your little one asked, I couldn't lie to her." Sam leaned back, his eyes fixed on the dying flames. "Hope never knew her mother. Anna died the night that child was born." Rose looked up, startled. "I buried her in the red earth down by the creek," Sam continued, his voice flat and empty. "Lucy was 6. She just stood there in the cold, clutching my hand. I didn't cry. I couldn't. There was too much to carry, but I'm still carrying it. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was a shared weight, not a solitary burden. Rose's eyes glistened in the firelight. I thought I was the only one walking with ghosts. Sam met her gaze from across the hearth. For the first time, he didn't look away. Seems we both are. The days that followed were different. A subtle shift had occurred. Rose started to speak more, not a lot, but enough that her presence felt less like a shadow and more like a quiet melody struggling to be heard again. She told Hope simple stories while she mended their clothes. Stories about Eli, how he had loved to chase fireflies in the twilight, how he once fell asleep under the kitchen table clutching a small wooden horse. Hope listened, rapt, as if this lost boy were her own brother. Lucy pretended not to hear, but Sam saw her watching from the corner of the room, the guard in her eyes slowly, almost imperceptibly, softening. One evening, Rose went down to the creek to fetch a bucket of water. Lucy followed her, keeping her distance. Sam watched them through the window. He saw Rose pause by the cottonwood trees, her hand resting on the trunk of the largest one, as if to steady herself. She knelt and touched the earth. Lucy stood there for a long moment, hesitating. Then she stepped forward and offered to help carry the heavy bucket back to the cabin. She didn't say a word, but Sam saw the gesture for what it was. The first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Later that week, a gentle, steady rain began to fall, a blessing in this dry, thirsty land. Rose sat on the porch with Hope, patiently showing her how to stitch a torn sleeve. Lucy lingered in the doorway, restless. Rose glanced up, the needle poised in her hand. Would you like to learn too? Lucy stiffened, pride warring with a flicker of curiosity. I don't need to. Neither did I, Rose said softly, until I tore my only good dress and had no one to fix it for me. Lucy hesitated, then she slowly edged closer. Rose guided her hands, patient and quiet. Lucy's first stitches were crooked and clumsy, but when Rose smiled at her, a genuine warm smile, Lucy's defenses crumbled. For the first time since her mother's death, she smiled back. That night, Sam sat at the table long after the girls were asleep. Rose was by the hearth, her shawl draped over her shoulders, humming a low, simple tune. He didn't recognize it, but it was soothing, like the sound of wind in the pines. When she noticed him listening, she blushed. It's just something I used to sing to Eli. I didn't realize I was. Don't stop, Sam said. His voice was rough, but it wasn't a command. It was a plea. She held his gaze for a moment, then she began to hum again, the soft thread of the melody weaving its way through the quiet cabin. Sam closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. In that fragile moment, somewhere between grief and hope, they both knew. Silence had given way to words, and words had begun to weave the first tentative threads of belonging. The rain lingered for days, a persistent, chilling dampness that seeped into the cabin's logs. Sam spent his days mending fences and tending to the livestock, leaving Rose alone with the girls for long stretches. She took on the household duties without a word of complaint. Her silence was no longer a wall. It was a quiet space where small kindnesses could grow. Hope followed her everywhere, a tiny, adoring shadow. Lucy, though she was softening, still kept her guard up. She helped with the chores, but she moved with a careful distance, drawing invisible lines that she dared Rose to cross. One evening, after a long day of damp, biting wind, Lucy started to cough. At first, it was just a small, dry hack that she tried to shrug off, but by nightfall, her skin was hot to the touch, and she was curled under her quilt, shivering, even though the fire in the hearth burned bright. "Papa," Hope whispered, her voice urgent as she tugged on Sam's sleeve when he came in from the barn. "Lucy's burning up." Sam strode to the bed and laid his hand on his eldest daughter's forehead. A wave of heat radiated from her. His jaw tightened. It's the chill. She'll sweat it out. Rose hovered nearby, clutching her shawl. She needs cool cloths, she said softly. Sam hesitated. It had been years since another woman's voice had offered advice in his home, but her eyes held no judgment, only a deep, familiar worry. He gave a short, sharp nod. Do what you can. The night stretched on, long and dark. Rose sat by Lucy's bedside, dipping a rag into a basin of cool water and laying it gently across the girl's feverish forehead. She coaxed sips of broth between Lucy's cracked lips, whispering words of encouragement when the girl tried to turn her head away. Lucy, lost in the delirium of the fever, muttered sharp, broken phrases. Don't take him away. And he's ours. He's all we have. Each word was a small, sharp blade that cut at Rose, but she didn't falter. She held the child's hand, smoothing the damp hair back from her face. I won't take him, she whispered. I promise. I just want to help you breathe easier. When Lucy cried out in her sleep, Rose began to sing, soft lullabies she had once sung to Eli. Her voice trembled at first, thick with memory, but it steadied with each note, wrapping the sick child in a fragile cocoon of sound. Hope was curled on a blanket on the floor, watching with wide, solemn eyes. She had never seen anyone sit so still, so patient, for her sister. Not even her father, who loved them fiercely, but whose hands were calloused and whose grief often stole his words. Through the long hours of the night, Rose did not leave Lucy's side. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, she was still there. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, her body swaying with weariness, but she was still holding Lucy's hand. When Sam came in from the corral that morning, that's how he found them. Lucy, finally sleeping a peaceful, sweat-cooled sleep, and Rose, slumped in the chair beside the bed, her head resting near the child's arm. Her fingers were still wrapped around Lucy's small hand, as if even in sleep, she was afraid to let go. Sam stood in the doorway for a long time, a dull ache spreading through his chest. It wasn't just gratitude, it wasn't pity. It was the raw, undeniable recognition of a heart that had chosen to give everything it had left, with no promise of anything in return. He quietly took a blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed and draped it over Rose's shoulders. She stirred, but she didn't wake. The fever broke on the second day. Lucy blinked her eyes open and found Rose still sitting there. Her hair had fallen loose from its pins, and her shawl was rumpled. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. For a long moment, Lucy just stared. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart, the ones she had been reinforcing since her mother's death, began to crumble at the sight of the woman who had stayed. You didn't leave, Lucy whispered, her voice raspy. Rose straightened up slowly, brushing a strand of hair back from Lucy's face. No, she said softly. I'll never leave while you need me. The child's throat tightened. She turned her face away, toward the wall, but not before Rose saw the tears welling in her eyes. That evening, Lucy tried to get out of bed to help set the table for supper. Rose gently pressed her back down onto the mattress. Rest, little one. Lucy frowned. I'm not little. A faint smile touched Rose's lips. No, you've carried more than most grown-ups, but even the strongest hearts need to be taken care of sometimes. Lucy studied her face, searching for any hint of a lie. She found none. Slowly, almost shyly, she whispered, Thank you. The two small words, so fragile and so long in coming, made Rose's chest ache. She bent down and pressed a kiss to the girl's temple. You're welcome, Lucy. Over the next few days, Lucy started to watch Rose differently. She noticed the patience in Rose's hands as she brushed Hope's tangled curls. She heard the soft, humming tune that Rose sang to herself while she was mending. She saw the way Rose would sometimes pause and look out the window, her eyes distant, but no longer empty. One afternoon, Lucy crept out onto the porch where Rose was patching a torn sleeve. The jar of wildflowers was still on the small table beside her, the blooms long since wilted and dried. "Why do you still keep them?" Lucy asked, pointing a small finger at the dead flowers. "They're dead." Rose looked up, the afternoon sun soft on her tired face. "Because they remind me that beauty comes, even if it's only for a little while. And sometimes, just remembering is enough to keep you going." Lucy considered this, her small hands twisting in her lap. I thought if you stayed, Papa wouldn't need us anymore." Rose set aside her needle and thread. Her voice was gentle. "Your father needs you more than anything in this world, Lucy. And so do I." Lucy's eyes widened and tears brimmed over, running down her cheeks. She leaned forward suddenly and wrapped her arms around Rose's waist, burying her face in the soft fabric of her dress. "Don't go," she whispered. Rose froze for a second, then she held the girl close, her own silent tears falling onto Lucy's hair. "I won't. Not if you'll have me." That night, when Sam came in from the fields, Lucy met him at the door. Her voice was small but certain. "Papa, she took care of me, like Mama would have." Sam's throat went tight. He looked at his daughter, then at Rose, who was standing quietly by the hearth, her eyes lowered but shining. He laid a hand on Lucy's head. "Then maybe she belongs here after all." Lucy nodded, her arms tightening around Rose's waist. And for the first time since grief had hardened her young heart, she let herself believe in the possibility of another mother's love. The fever left Lucy weaker, but it also left her softer, like iron that had been heated in a fire and hammered into something new. She followed Rose with her eyes now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, anxious yearning, as if she were afraid the woman might disappear if she looked away for too long. Hope was the first to notice the change. "Lucy, you're not scowling at her anymore," she teased one morning as Rose was braiding her hair. Lucy's cheeks flushed red, and she hugged her doll tighter. "I wasn't scowling." Rose just smiled. She was learning that Lucy's pride was a tender, easily bruised thing. Instead of saying anything, she finished Hope's braid and handed Lucy the brush. "Would you like to try?" Lucy blinked, surprised. "Me? You have a steadier hand than I do when I'm tired." The girl hesitated for a moment, then she set her doll aside. She took the brush and began to work on Rose's other braid, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Hope giggled when Lucy tugged a little too hard, but when the braid was finished and tied with a ribbon, she beamed. Rose leaned over and kissed the top of Lucy's head. "Perfect." Lucy's breath hitched. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the simple, gentle praise of a mother's voice. That evening, while Sam was outside mending a harness, Rose sat by the hearth with both girls. The rain had finally stopped, and the world smelled of damp earth and new life. "Tell us a story," Hope begged, climbing into Rose's lap. Lucy hovered nearby, still hesitant. Rose smoothed Hope's hair, her eyes looking into the dancing flames of the fire. "Once, there was a boy who thought the stars were lanterns that his mother had hung in the sky so he wouldn't be afraid of the dark. He told everyone that the biggest, brightest star was her smile, shining down to guide him." Her voice faltered for a second, but she went on, softer now. Even when he couldn't see her, he knew she was still there. Hope's eyelids began to droop, lulled by the soft, sad story. Lucy sat very still, watching Rose's profile in the firelight. Something stirred inside her, a deep, aching recognition of loss, but also of a love that could endure even death. When Hope was finally asleep, Lucy whispered, "Did you really know a boy like that?" Rose looked at her, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, his name was Eli." Lucy swallowed hard. I think maybe Mama is a star too." Rose reached out and took the girl's hand. I believe she is. And I believe she's very proud of you. Lucy didn't pull her hand away. The days folded into one another, and the little cabin began to fill with a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Rose cooked simple meals, taught the girls how to do small chores, and sometimes she sang her low, quiet songs at dusk. One afternoon, she knelt in the small patch of garden that Sam had cleared by the creek, pressing tiny seedlings into the dark, rich soil. Lucy hovered nearby, awkward and uncertain. "Would you like to plant one?" Rose asked, holding out a tender green sprout. Lucy shook her head. "They'll just die. Everything does." Rose met her gaze, her eyes steady. "Maybe, but while they're alive they give us food or beauty or hope. Isn't that worth the risk?" Lucy bit her lip. Slowly, she took the small sprout from Rose's hand and pushed it into the soil. Her fingers trembled, but when she patted the earth down firmly around the tiny plant, something inside her chest eased. Rose laid her hand over Lucy's. "You've given it a chance. That's all any of us can do." The girl looked up, and for the first time, there was no wall in her eyes. That night, Sam came home to find Rose sewing by the light of the lamp. Hope was asleep across her lap, and Lucy was sitting beside her, her head resting against Rose's arm. "Lucy," Sam said, surprised, "you'll cramp her if you lean on her so heavy." Lucy's cheeks flushed, but she didn't move. She looked at her father, then back at Rose. Words hovered on her lips, fragile and new. Rose stroked the girl's hair absently, not realizing the momentous thing that was trembling on the edge of the child's heart. Finally, Lucy whispered, so soft it was almost lost in the quiet of the room, "Mama." The word fell like a stone into still water, its ripples spreading through the cabin. Rose's hands froze, her sewing falling into her lap. Her eyes filled with tears, overflowing before she could stop them. She gathered Lucy into her arms, her whole body trembling. "Oh, sweetheart." Sam stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. He had not heard that word spoken in his home since Anna's death. To hear it now, addressed not to a ghost, but to this woman who had so patiently and quietly given so much of herself, struck him with a force he wasn't prepared for. Lucy clung to her, sobbing now. "Don't leave us. Please, don't ever leave." Rose rocked her gently, her tears falling into the child's hair. "I won't. Not as long as I draw breath, I won't." Sam turned away, his hand gripping the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned white. He had sworn to himself he would never hope again, never open that old wound of longing, but the sound of his daughter's voice, calling another woman mother, had just cracked something wide open inside him. Later, after the girls were settled in their bed, Sam lingered by the hearth. Rose sat nearby, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes swollen but soft. "She called you Mama," Sam said, his voice rough. Rose lowered her gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never thought." He shook his head. "You earned it, not by asking for it, by staying." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that was still unsaid. The fire crackled and snapped, filling the space. At last, Sam murmured, "Thank you for giving her back a piece of what she lost." Rose's eyes met his across the warm glow of the embers. "She gave me back a piece, too." For a long moment, neither of them looked away. There was no promise spoken, no declaration made. There was only the steady, certain knowledge that something fragile and real had taken root between them, as real as the seedlings Lucy had pressed into the dark soil of the garden. Spring came to the valley slowly, stubbornly. Snowmelt from the high ridges swelled the creek, and the cottonwood trees began to bud a pale, tender green. For the first time since she had buried her family, Rose felt the turn of the season in her own veins. She rose early each morning, stepping barefoot onto the cool earth of the garden patch Sam had cleared for her. He had pulled stones from the soil until his hands were raw, then left it for her with a simple nod, an unspoken acknowledgement. "This is yours now." Hope darted around her like a hummingbird. "I want to plant the big seeds. Can I? Can I?" Rose laughed softly. "The beans first, little one. They're strong enough to grow even with your rough hands." Lucy stood at the edge of the garden, her arms folded, pretending to be uninterested. But when Rose pressed a handful of small seeds into her palm, she didn't refuse. She crouched down, carefully pushing each seed into the soil. Her movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as if she were laying something precious to rest. And perhaps she was. "Good," Rose murmured. "The earth will remember your touch." Lucy looked up, her eyes shy but steady. She didn't speak, but the flicker of pride on her face was enough. The garden changed their evenings. Instead of a silence heavy with ghosts, the cabin filled with a gentle bustle. The girls checked the soil every day, racing to see whose seeds would sprout first. Sam built a low fence around the patch to keep the deer out, his quiet presence a steady anchor to their work. One night, as the sun set behind the ridges, painting the sky in shades of crimson, Rose carried a small jar of water to the garden. She poured it slowly over the tender green shoots. Sam came and stood beside her, leaning on the shovel he'd been using. "You've got their hearts buried in this dirt now," he said, nodding toward where Lucy and Hope were arguing over which plant would grow the tallest. Rose smiled faintly. "Maybe mine too." Sam studied her in the fading light. "That's good. Land only really lives when people give it more than just their sweat. You've given it memory." Rose's throat tightened. She thought of Eli, of the lonely hill where he lay buried, but for the first time, the memory didn't hollow her out. It rooted her. She looked at Sam, and in his eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw recognition. She saw the reflection of her own long, hard road through loss. Word of Rose's presence still caused whispers in the nearby town. At the mercantile, women would turn their backs when she entered. Their children would stare. One afternoon, a neighbor woman muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "A widow with no place of her own, clinging to that man's charity." Lucy bristled, ready to lash out, but Rose put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let it go, little one." "Why?" Lucy demanded. "They're wrong!" Rose knelt down, her eyes level with the girls. "Because we know the truth. And the truth doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to be lived." Lucy blinked, then she slowly nodded. For the first time, she felt not just defended, but guided. The garden thrived. Rows of beans climbed up the poles Sam had set for them, and squash leaves sprawled wide and green. In between them, Rose had planted a strip of wildflower seeds that Hope had gathered. One evening, Lucy brought her doll outside and tucked it carefully between the flowers. "She can watch them grow," she explained shyly. Rose kissed her forehead. "Then she'll see how strong they become." Hope clapped her hands. "When the flowers bloom, we'll make crowns and wear them to supper." From the porch, Sam chuckled, a rare but rich sound. "Crowns, eh? Guess I'll need a throne." Hope raced to him and climbed onto his knee, placing an imaginary wreath on his head. "You already have one, Papa King." Rose watched them, a quiet awe filling her chest. She hadn't thought she would ever feel the lightness of laughter again, but here it was, woven into the simple fabric of an ordinary day. One night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, tangled together in their bed, Rose sat on the porch with Sam. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Sam handed her a folded piece of cloth. "Found this in the chest," he said gruffly. "Figured you'd have more use for it than I would." Rose unfolded it carefully. It was an old piece of linen, clumsily embroidered with tiny flowers. The stitches were uneven, but the effort was tender and full of love. Anna started that, Sam said quietly. Never finished it. I thought it ought to be used, not hidden away. Rose's eyes stung with tears. She traced the delicate stitches with a reverent finger. I'll finish it. For her. For the girls. Sam nodded. The silence between them was easy now, companionable. Finally he said, This land. It was hers. After she passed, it just felt empty. Now it's alive again. You did that. Rose looked down, overwhelmed. I only planted a few seeds. Seeds don't grow without care, he said simply. Their eyes met in the starlight, and though no vow was spoken, something solid and certain settled between them. The shape of a family, born not of blood or of chance, but of choice. Weeks later, the wildflowers bloomed, a riot of bright color against the dark soil. Lucy and Hope wove them into crowns, just as they had promised, giggling as they placed one on Rose's head. You're the queen, Hope declared. Lucy's voice was softer, more certain. No, she said. She's our mama. Rose drew them both into a tight embrace, her tears falling not from grief, but from a joy she had thought was lost to her forever. Sam watched them from the porch, his arms folded, his heart swelling with a peace he had never expected to feel again. The garden rustled in the evening breeze, alive with color and scent. It was a testament to what they had built together. Out of silence, sorrow, and a fragile, battered hope, they had grown roots deep enough to hold. And there, in that small patch of land beside the creek, beneath the wide western sky, they had become, at last, a family. If you enjoyed this story, your support means the world. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Thank you for being here.